So let's have a little chat about chapter 3 of Strong Towns, the book. This
Yes,
is our latest installment of Ask the Author with none other than the author, Chuck Marohn.
I actually
Uh,
have the book.
you have the book right there.
Yeah.
Where did I
Chapter
even place? Oh, it's hiding
chapter
here.
3 is the there you go. Chapter 3 is the back in the day when I was first starting to write a book, the book was just chapter 3. So the idea of like simplifying what essentially I think was an entire, decade of my career trying to figure something out down to 6,000 words in one chapter um, was a big undertaking, but it took a long time. But I think it's way better having done it that way. You're really reading the Curbside Chat in one chapter, basically, is what it sums up as, right?
Yeah, I would say that. This is the chapter of the book that I've read the greatest number of times because there's a
Mm.
lot of meat in it, and there are a lot of insights that are you kind of have to sink your teeth into and then sit with them for a while and then think, wait a minute, let me think about this again. Let me dive a little deeper because there's really a lot here. I would say chapter 3, Chuck kind of describes the sort of down the rabbit hole moment that you had
Right.
running your own planning consulting firm before you started Strong Towns, and starting to realize that these projects that you were working on for cities and you were advising them on, that none of them were delivering a positive return on investment, that when you actually started to crunch the numbers and say, could we do this again and again and again, what you found was absolutely insane. It was, well, no, we can't afford to do this at all. We are losing money on every one of these transactions. This road is going to take 79 years just to pay for its own maintenance costs, and the
Right.
asphalt isn't going to last half that long. So I'm wondering, having in the environment you were in kind of during the last big real estate boom, working in central Minnesota, doing this work with kind of the growth industry with engineering and development and all of that, and starting to question these things that were really foundational to the work you were doing. What was it like sort of emotionally grappling with
Oh,
this notion that you were seeing something that all the other people around you didn't seem to see?
yeah. Well, I think at first there was a lot of doubt. And doubt, I'm not a person who's racked by doubt. You know me, you've known me long enough. I tend to be pretty hard charging. But there was this period of time when I was delving into this stuff when I'm like, this is so obvious. Like I'm seeing something here that is so self-evident. And the math I'm doing is really ridiculously simple. What do I just not get? What have really smart people figured out that get this in a way that I don't. And I'll equate it a little bit to like imposter syndrome, where you believe that everybody around you like knows something more than you or has something more than you figured out. And it was really for me, like I'm looking around at all these people who had been mentors to me, who I thought were very, very intelligent, who were involved in this, people who were in leadership positions and authority positions. And they were all talking about these projects like they were great and they were creating growth and jobs and wonderful. And aren't we doing well? And, this is going to have a positive impact for everybody. And the first reaction I had was just like, when I started to delve into it in this way was what am I not seeing? Like, what do I not get? And then I went through my what I just called, I don't think I called it in this book, but I've called it in the past my fanatic phase. Winston Churchill describes a fanatic as someone who can't change their mind and won't change the subject. And I ran around like talking to everybody I could, like shaking them, like, do you know that this big box store is going to bankrupt us? Do you know that this is all failing? Like, are you aware of this? Like, come on. And it really cost me a lot of, maybe a lot of relationships in the mid 2000s because I was sitting in these meetings where we had a decade or more of great growth, and all these companies that were in the growth industry were booming. All my peers were doing really well. It was like the sun was shining and the fields were growing and everything was great. And here is this crazy Marone coming in going, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. The finances don't work. Why can't everyone see this? And there was a lot of, and I don't blame them. I blame me. I was not a good messenger. But I was pretty ostracized from a lot of places. In fact, I lost clients and lost jobs because they're like, just we'll have a meeting, but don't invite Chuck. He's going to tell us that this was a bad project and we just don't want to hear it. So, it was, I remember once driving into the office, and I lived way out of town at the time, and I was driving in and on my drive in, I'd drive past all the big box stores. And I remember looking over thinking, at some point, there's going to be like trees growing up in the middle of all those, and the parking lot's going to be bad. And it's this picture of doom in my mind. And it made me feel really, really sad. And I think, that part of my life was emotionally very, very, very draining, very difficult. Those were dark days, Daniel.
So one thing that there's an interesting kind of timing piece in my mind to sort of the origin story of Strong Towns, which is that you were doing a lot of this work kind of during the pre-2008 real estate boom. And then we have this huge housing market collapse and stock market collapse. And all of a sudden there's sort of a market for voices who are saying, well, I told you so all along. And you look at, in the finance side of things, you've got people like Nassim Taleb, who really came in part to their popular fame by saying, I told you so all along, this was going to go bad. And I felt a little bit of that when I discovered you, because I started reading the Strong Towns blog around 2010. And there was a bit of schadenfreude for me as someone who had been an urbanist for a long time and kind of had this reflexive distaste for the autocentric spread out suburban development pattern without the ability to articulate the things you were articulating. But I find this blog and it's kind of like, I'm an instant cheerleader. Like, here's this guy saying, I told you so, the suburbs were a disaster, they were going to go bad, and look, they did. Right. So in light of that, I'm wondering, if you look at kind of where we are now in terms of the real estate market, in terms of the economy, housing prices are back up higher than their 2006, 2007 peak. There's a lot of that sort of irrational exuberance back in the development industry again. And so I'm wondering what has changed in your perception in how the Strong Towns message is received now in growing places versus 5 or 8 years ago, or how you have to deliver that message?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question. Let's be clear. When you and I kind of found each other in 2010, when you started reading this stuff that I was producing, it's very interesting because I think, we're both converging on a series of points in the same way. My inspiration for this was never like, I hate suburbia or I don't like suburbia. In fact, I loved suburbia. I was the guy out building it. I lived in it. I thrived in it. I thought like, this is the perfect place for me. I did have some like design concerns, and I think I would have put myself in the new urbanist kind of camp of, let's build a nicer suburb. Like how can we build a nicer suburb and make it really, beautiful? And I still, I still am sympathetic to that to a degree, the beauty aspect of it. But my, the thing that kind of brought me to the table, so to speak, was that, the finances didn't work. And let's be clear, I didn't call the housing crisis. Like, I didn't get that whole aspect of it. That was all like icing on the Schadenfreude cake, if we want to call it that. I was looking at it just from like a city finance standpoint, trying to understand why every place that I worked with was both A, growing, and B, going broke. Like, they had all kinds of growth, but absolutely no money to do anything. How is that possible if the growth creates money? Like it didn't make sense. And so, by the time I sat down and started to write, I was exploring a lot of the urbanist stuff that I think was more natural to you. I was exploring it in this light of decades and decades of financial shenanigans and as I described later on in the book, of basically like putting off difficult feedback. And here it's manifested in our cities going broke. And wow, simultaneous with that, we've bankrupted our families and the housing market and like all this other stuff associated with it. You go through then a decade of explaining this to people. And I think a lot of the early people who were involved in our conversation were very much like you, where the stuff that I was saying filled a void for them in their understanding. I don't like the suburbs. I don't like the design. There's a social ramification. There's a whole bunch of things that I don't like here. And now here's this guy coming in, explaining the finances of it in a way that really aligns with what my gut tells me. And that was really powerful, because I think maybe what is not well appreciated is how many things like I learned from the other side of that conversation. You and I sit down and I can kind of lay out, well, here's the engineering side of this, and here's kind of the math, and here's like how this works. And you're like, wow, that's crazy. But then you talk to me about some of the other aspects of it that really were not second nature to me. So by the time you sit here today in 2010, or I'm sorry, in 2020, a decade later, I look at this and I feel like we are in, I feel like we're in crazy land. Like everything that I saw in 2008, I see again now, but on steroids. Everything that I experienced in 2008, I'm experiencing now, but magnified. We're building here in my hometown, brand new roads to nowhere, strip malls, big box stores, new housing subdivisions. We're not growing at all. We're not adding more people. We're not doing anything. We're just like going through the motions of repeating the same thing over and over and over, because like we don't have any other ideas of what to do. I can go down to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the exurbs that I was working in back in 2004, 2005, 2006, and they're all growing like crazy. They're all adding new houses, new roads, and it's like that's the froth on the underlying, craziness. What's different, you see more urban development. You do see like, I think, a broader marketplace. I mean, there is demand here in Minnesota for Minneapolis living. There's demand here in my hometown for in-town living, where there really wasn't 15 years ago, at least not to the degree. So in a sense, you've got a little bit of, this manifesting in different ways, but you still have the overall Ponzi scheme aspect of how we build cities front and center, kind of driving the agenda. The burden that we have now today is that in 2020, we kind of, I said back in 2008, I didn't call the housing crisis, didn't understand that aspect of it. Today, I look at it, I'm like, this is all insane. Like there's no way you continue with price to income ratio of 6-to-1, 7-to-1. There's no way you go in my little town and have a price income ratio of 4-to-1 and have it be viable. Wages either have to inflate way, way up with housing staying normal, or housing prices need to come way, way down, which like crashes the whole economy. And I feel like it's less stable, more like close to going super critical than it's ever been. And chapter 3 causes me to lose sleep.
Totally. Yeah, it's this is something that it continues to be in my face more and more. It's kind of, it's that rabbit hole thing. Once you understand it, you see it everywhere.
Yeah. And
on some level, like, it's still hard for me to believe this notion that the vast majority of places in North America are functionally insolvent. Mm-hmm. But then I look at like my hometown of St. Paul, which is a really nice city. It's, full of middle-class people living really pretty nice lives. Like, in a lot of ways, it's a well-run place. And yet St. Paul is in the news all the time. And I wrote a piece about it just yesterday about how St. Paul has an infrastructure maintenance deficit that's like, they need twice again their whole maintenance budget
right every
year. And they're at this point where the streets are crumbling so rapidly that they can no longer do inexpensive routine maintenance. And they're going to have to do really expensive, quick stopgap fixes. And it's this really dire situation. And
this is a well-run, productive place.
Right.
Right.
It doesn't square with my gut understanding of like the place where I grew up and lived for 20 years, but it's also increasingly undeniable.
So I wrote that piece on this past Monday about Baxter, the neighboring city to Brainerd. You can think of Brainerd and Baxter as sister cities. Brainerd is the old railroad town. That's where I live. Next door was Baxter. That's where I grew up. Baxter, when I was a kid, was less than 1,000 people. Today it's around 9,000. So that's where all the suburban growth went. All the big box stores are there. All the drive-through franchise restaurants, the cul-de-sac developments are all there. They're in the process right now of doing, I think the only way you would call it is like a road widening project. I mean, they're taking a traffic signal and they're moving it to an intersection where it would work better. They are taking that intersection and widening it out a little bit. They're taking a road that's kind of like a shortcut and making it into a more of a thoroughfare. So they're just basically like tweaking the system a little bit to, in a SimCity kind of way, optimize traffic flow from, as viewed from 30,000 feet. You look at that $5.5 million project and you compare that to the capital outlay in their budget. So here's how much money every year we budget for capital improvements, for doing things like fixing roads and maintaining stuff and building things. It's 110 years of their capital outlay in one project. Now, they're not paying for the project. The project's being paid by federal government grant, state government. They want to get bonding money from the legislature. They're trying to assess some businesses that they're trying to get in. So they're trying to get some developer money to pay for some of this. They're basically piecing together a project. But the reality is that if this project goes and it's successful and it works out, the next time they got to go out and fix all this stuff, the next time they got to go out and maintain these things and take care of them, it's basically like 100 years of their budget is what it's going to cost to do that. That's insane. Like that, there's no way that and that's just for like a project that they don't really need. What about the road actually in front of your house or the road that you actually need to go somewhere? I had the advantage in terms of our conversation in growing up and being a professional in what is a very simplified, but also very like personified, like magnified situation. So you look at the struggles that they have in St. Paul and it's very real and you can see it and you can experience it, but it's also part of a big system. And so like you say, it's hard to get your mind wrapped around and there's a lot of slack in the system and like things sloshing around. So you can kind of get lost in it. You go to a city like Baxter and it's the same exact problem, but it's in hyper reality. So everything is like, it's like a caricature of St. Paul. So like, in a caricature, they take every little person, every little thing you got and like magnify and draw it out. You look at Baxter's budget and it's St. Paul's budget, but a fifth the size, but every like problem is exaggerated. You look at Brainerd's development pattern and it's the same as St. Paul's development pattern, but every like problem is so much easier to see because it's not hidden in this bigger system. And I actually think that if you did a Malcolm Gladwell outliers kind of analysis of my life, you would say that the thing that gave me an insight advantage over other people who are more intelligent and more thoughtful and what have you than I am, the thing that gave me this intellectual insight was that I lived in this place where all of the things that we talk about are in like hyper reality. They're easier to see here because the system is smaller in a sense.
Right. That's really interesting to hear you put it that way, that Brainerd and Baxter are this weird little object lesson that allows you to sort of actually see what's going on in a way that, like, the response I usually get when I talk about something like St. Paul's maintenance deficit is people refuse to believe that it's some more fundamental aspect of the way we build. And instead they say, oh, well, it's just a matter of shifting money around from this pot to that pot. You know, why don't we just plug this hole in the budget from
Well,
somewhere else in the budget?
You and I had these discussions. I won't call them arguments, but back and forth conversations in 2011, 12. You're like, well, why don't we just raise taxes, dummy? You know?
Well, yeah. And I think that makes a really good segue into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is about the role of financing mechanisms in all of this. There's a piece in chapter 3 of the book that I keep coming back to that's really, really interesting, where you sort of zoom out, as this book does so well, to a more fundamental question of human nature. And you're talking about Jared Diamond and some of his work with traditional societies, and the notion of what happens when you have a system that is kind of a complex system that is evolved and honed based on, I don't want to say scarcity, but I mean, yeah, scarcity.
It is scarcity.
Resource limitations.
Right.
And so we have to balance and harmonize all these competing interests. And all of a sudden you flood that system with resources. And Diamond's example is, well, what happens to human health when all of a sudden our nutrition, scarcity is no longer a factor. We can get all the calories we want and then some. And of course you have an epidemic of diabetes and you have an epidemic of obesity. And as humans, we're very hardwired when we have an infusion of a ton of resources, like money makes us stupid. Like we can take those resources, whether it's money, whether it's calories, whatever it is, and we can direct them toward just solving one problem, whatever problem is at hand, in a very tunnel vision way, and ignoring all of the knock-on effects. So I see that really clearly when you talk about these small towns where it's possible to get a federal grant for a project that is many, many times your annual budget. And that's sort of transparently insane in a way that nothing that happens in a city the size of St. Paul is going to be so transparently insane. But I guess my question for you is, if we diagnose that as a core part of the problem, that kind of a flood of resources without feedback mechanisms causes us to get ourselves into trouble, what do you do about it? How do you start disentangling yourself from these institutions we've set up where that is how you get your road paved?
Right. It's such a big question. You know, because when you look at like the difference between Baxter and St. Paul is that Baxter will go away. Like Baxter will actually fail in a way where like people won't live there. And St. Paul will just muddle through in a way that like a Detroit or a Memphis does, in whatever version you get in St. Paul of that kind of failure. I really thought it was important, and it's been an evolution in my thinking. And I credit, you and some others with pushing me in this way too. I think it's very easy for someone who in 94 cheered the Republican Revolution in the House, in the U.S. House, and someone who voted for, 92 is my first election. I voted for George Bush Sr. Then I voted for Bob Dole. Then I voted for George W. Bush. Then I voted for George W. Bush. Then I voted for McCain. Then I started to veer off the safe and easy one-party path. But I think it's very easy narrative for someone who comes from my past and my understanding to look at the system and say what a lot of conservatives and Republicans say today, which is cities are poorly run. Cities are run by Democrats. Look, they run them into the ground. They tax too much. They waste money. They da. And I think it's very easy for someone from a different political bent to look at this same exact set of circumstances and say, this is capitalism. It's the corporations exploiting the worker. It's people not willing to pay their share. And there's a whole like narrative that goes with that. And I've grown beyond both those narratives. Like I find both of them like oversimplifications. I do think that it was really important, and I tried very hard in this book, and I think Jared Diamond is a good, a good inspiration for me to step back and say, like, no, these things are like deeper human struggles. Um, when you give humans who are used to not having much food abundant sugary snacks, they will consume abundant sugary snacks to the point where they develop diabetes and obesity and become sick. And that's not because they are weak or, bad people or, what have you. It's just because we evolved under conditions of scarcity. And our brain says, when you can get a nice sugary snack like a Kickstart Mountain Dew, let me see if you can, yep. Oh, when you can get something like that, you are going to pursue that with a gusto. And, that's the way we are. So you look at, cities, and cities solve this problem for us like so perfectly. We wanted to grow. We wanted more revenue. We wanted more jobs. We wanted to get, solve all these things in our economy. And we just create more growth, it would be great. So let's just pump a bunch of money into building new infrastructure and building new systems. And look, it worked. It's fabulous. And every time we ran into a problem, it was like, well, let's just do more of that. Let's just pump more and more and more into this system without the feedbacks, without the checks, without the nasty pain of learning from your mistakes. When I look at the issue of like obesity, it's very clear that for many people, diet and exercise doesn't work. There's people who are physiologically not thriving with our current like diet regime. And I struggle to know, like, what do you do with those people? I have people in my family my aunt who says, all I have to do is smell a cupcake and I gain 5 pounds. And you know what? I've seen her struggle with weight, and I've seen her be very disciplined about what she eats, and I've seen her exercise, and she still struggles with it. Her physiology is not well adapted to like the modern diet. And I don't know what you do with that. But the vast majority of people, there's a combination of self-discipline, diet, exercise, saying no to the extra snacks, balancing your own food caloric intake, balancing that with your exercise regime. That will get you to maybe not the optimum place, but to some place that will thrive and survive and allow you to lead a prosperous life. When I look at cities and I look at local governments, this collection of us working together to try to make a place successful and viable and prosperous and strong, it takes a certain level of discipline, the same kind of part of your brain that allows you to not just eat solid sugary snacks, but to actually eat a balanced diet and exercise. And it takes a certain amount of brain power that we as humans have. We have the capacity to do this, to actually think about what you're doing and make some disciplined choices to say no to the equivalent of the sugar snack and to say yes to the healthy diet and exercise. I think you can, we have this conversation in this country about, the other and how we look at each other and how we understand each other. And I think one of the primary arguments of the left in this country or progressives in this country, which I think is a correct argument, is that the more we talk about and discuss and understand and educate people, the less some of those differences matter, or the more we see each other in each other, or the more we find we have in common with each other. And a big part of left of center thinking goes to education. The smarter we, or not the smarter, but the more informed we are about others, the more we can deal with some of the things that maybe are more tribal instincts or base instincts in our brains that tell us to fear the other and react in a certain way to people we don't know or don't understand. I think that same parts of the brain are what need to be tapped into here for us to create this kind of collective self-discipline in how we, how we go about assembling our places. And that I feel oftentimes like our job here is to sell diet and exercise to people who are living on sugar snacks. And that's hard enough for like gyms to do, and diet programs to do. It's really hard because we're not doing it individual to individual. We're actually doing it individual to like collectively we're consuming sugar snacks. And that's a much harder challenge.
I studied anthropology a good deal in my undergraduate career way back when. And one of the sort of big picture lessons that really made an impression on me, and this relates to Jared Diamond's work too, when you look at traditional societies, you often find that things that they do that to a modern eye seem really irrational or superstitious or even bizarre,
right,
actually have a function. And they have a function in terms of regulating collective behavior, in terms of some sort of self-discipline that often comes down to like resource conservation and resilience.
right.
But things that just look like these weird irrational taboos have a purpose. So I'm wondering, like, what would be the taboos or the like surface level irrational rules that a city should abide by in order to reimpose that kind of diet and exercise, we're in this for the long run discipline? What would be an example of that for you?
It's a great question. This is the fascinating thing because, I just made an argument that we need some type of education. We need to up our, use parts of our brain that can connect multiple things together to help us be intentional about what we do. And then you just reminded me and humbled me again that, this is not a matter of being educated or elite or, that what we find is the most thoughtful behaviors often in the places that where you're kind of forced to do this. I have a number of examples in the book of societies that we would call primitive that are actually incredibly advanced in their thinking in ways that like we're not even fully grasping. And I credit Jared Diamond in a big way for opening my eyes to a lot of those. I'll give you one that jumps to mind to answer your question. I think the way we use debt today. There are theories of debt at the federal level and national economies that suggest that it doesn't matter how much debt we take on. It doesn't matter how much money we print. There are certain limitations, but they're not the limitations of traditional economics where you have to save in order to invest and all these things. I agree and disagree to degrees with those theories. But the reality is those theories often get then interpreted down to the local level. And I hear cities say, it's a great time to do a project because interest rates are so low, or our borrowing capacity is way higher now because, they just adjusted the amount that we're able to qualify for without getting downgraded. We can take on this project because we can finance it and it won't affect our bond rating. These are very like common things that I think have evolved out of our, and I'm gonna give you two sides of the coin, comfort level, and I think growing dependence on debt financing in order to keep our economy going, our macro economy going. At the local level, I think our blasé approach to debt is the thing that ultimately is going to sink us. You look at Baxter, the city I talked about earlier, the neighboring city to Brainerd here, a full 40, I'm spitballing this here, but it's over 40%, like 43, 44% of their locally collected revenue. So the money that they collect locally that they can like depend on from year to year. So not the money that's coming in from the state, not the like one-time fees for people coming and doing building permits, but like what wealth is your tax base producing? Over 4 cents of every dime, 40 cents of every dollar that they collect locally goes to pay debt. And that's general obligation debt. That doesn't count all the other debt that they've taken on where they go out and say, do a project and the project involves, like, let's say building a road with sewer and water, and then they assess the properties and they collect the money from those properties over time and then use that to pay back the debt. That's in addition to the 40% they're paying. And so if you look and say, well, tomorrow the state, we're going to have a recession. Let's even say let's do a very like current scenario. Let's say coronavirus slows our economy to the point where you see a 10% drop in earnings from companies, and you see a corresponding adjustment in share prices, and a corresponding adjustment in their ability to pay back their debts and their bonds, and corresponding layoffs, and corresponding, you see this kind of start to snowball, and you see the economy go into just a general recession. And the state government is bringing in less money, and the federal government is bringing in less money. And the state turns around and says, Baxter, we're not going to be able to send you in the next biennium millions of dollars to build roads and millions of dollars to kind of prop up. We're going to have to cut back. And, cutting back on local government aid is a better option than cutting back on, let's say, education or prisons or healthcare. So local government aid is what's going to get cut. And then Baxter sees a corresponding 10, 15, 20% drop in their overall property values, their sales tax collection, because people aren't, going out and buying luxury goods anymore or buying new cars. And all of a sudden you've got a city that instead of, 45% of its budget going to cover debt service is now up around 70% or 80% of its budget. What do you do? What do you do? And, and Baxter, like I said earlier, has got, these huge, massive outlays of maintenance that they're not even dealing with yet. This is the money they're using to continue to build this machine. What happens when you have that decrease and then you still have that huge debt overhang, and now you've got all these other bills coming due? I think that what will happen is we will first do what Detroit did, which is shortchange ourselves. So we'll put off that road maintenance. We'll cut back on our fire department budget. We'll cut back on our police department budget. We'll shut off our street lights overnight. We'll stop maintaining the parks. We, won't keep the library open past 4:00 because we can't afford it. And we'll start living like a lower quality of life because the bond people will demand that they get paid. And then at some point, we will also do what Detroit did, which is we'll turn around and stiff our bondholders. And there will be a massive default on municipal debt, but it will only happen after we have, in a sense, shortchanged ourselves to the point where it's too painful to continue to do so. I think debt is the one thing that we should impose some discipline on ourselves at the local level, because having low debt gives you options. It gives you optionality. And if you read your Taleb, the difference between species that evolve and thrive and species that meet like evolutionary dead ends is optionality. If you can adapt and adjust and change to stress and circumstances, you will survive and thrive. And if you've left yourself only, in a sense, one avenue for success, when that avenue is taken away from you, it's done. It's done. And I think debt takes away those avenues.
I think that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people who are motivated by a sense of there's an urgent problem and we got to deal with it now. And one thing that's interesting to me in this chapter and throughout your work, you talk about a lot of the models that we use as touchstones for the Strong Towns message are really, really ancient places. There's a piece you published on the website back in 2012 that I have referred back to a lot and linked back to a lot, and that the insights in it have found their way into the book as well. But it's an old essay called "Why Decline is Not Normal," and you talk about a trip to Italy and saying, why in North America we don't have a Milan or a Stresa or an Avignon in France as touchstones for these places that have really endured across centuries. And it gives you a whole different sense of what it means to be a resilient place, what it means to be a financially productive place. And I think the whole notion of cities playing an infinite game, as you talk about in the book, is a little bit foreign to a lot of North Americans because everything on this continent is so young.
Right.
And well, why don't we have a Milan? Well, we haven't been around long enough to have a Milan. And in some ways you have to step outside of the perspective of these really young places that maybe even haven't been through the whole rise and fall of the growth Ponzi scheme, as you describe it, to understand like that something like Detroit's fate is not this weird abnormality, that maybe that's the trajectory we're all on, and we're looking at such a short time frame that we don't see it.
So you and I have been to Disney World together a couple times. And we've gone to Downtown Disney. And I think the fascinating thing about Downtown Disney is that people tend to look at it as like a really, people who like it, who go there, can look at it as like a really nice version of what their city could be or should be, or, you know, it's a nice shopping area. The urbanism's pretty good. The buildings are all new. They look good. They clean things up. They take out the garbage. You know, it's nice space. I think what's really fascinating though is when you step back and look at it and recognize that these are basically temporary buildings. Even like the big, like the big movie theater, the big show pavilions, they're all basically like buildings that Disney would rip down in a decade or two if they could put something else there. They're all designed. None of them are designed like the Colosseum in Rome, right? Like none of them are designed like the Parthenon. There's no one who said we're going to build something and it will be here 500 years from now. Nothing is built that way. And so you come back to, you know, St. Paul, or you come back to Sarasota, or you come back to Brainerd, and you look around, and, you know, we have here very few buildings that would endure beyond one life, you know, one generation or two generations. And that's by design. We are in the process right now of building a fine arts center at the high school. The voters approved this to happen. As when I watch the building go up, it's all being built out of the same exact stuff that we build big box stores out of. You know, the concrete panels are being brought in and they're being assembled like, you know, Legos. And then we will put on the outside of that, you know, that's basically like the shell. And then we'll put our ornamentation and all of our stuff in that. But that shell's designed to last 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, it's done, you know, like yeah, you can patch it up and you can keep, but it's not going to last 200 years. It's not going to last 400 years. It's a temporary building. What I recognized, because I went through this phase, and I think all planners do, where you're like, you know, if we just increased our regulation and demanded higher quality buildings, that we could get stuff like Milan that would last forever. We get stuff that was really high quality. And it's silly, because what you recognize when you go to a place like that is that they went through this kind of natural life cycle too, where they had a lot of temporary buildings and they had a lot of cheaper space. And then they had kind of places that were like medium, that were, you know, not designed to last 10 years or 20 years, but maybe we're going to last a little bit longer than that, or be a little bit more substantial investment. And then they would build things every now and then that were, you know, like the Colosseum, where you would expect to see them 200 years, 300 years, 400 years from now. Or in the Colosseum's case, you know, over 1,000 years from now, the building's still there, or 2,000 years, excuse me. And I started to piece together and recognize this kind of more natural life cycle to buildings and to neighborhoods and to places, where instead of building what I would just call like the moderately cheap buildings, which is, you could say Disney Springs is that, it's moderately cheap buildings. These are not, you know, and they would exceed in development intensity and style pretty much everything we build brand new today here in my hometown. Baxter, every building being built on the commercial strip in Baxter is in a sense a throwaway building It's a
Right.
temporary building designed to be thrown away. The big box store is a temporary crap building designed to be thrown away. That's what it is. Um, when you look at that and you say, well, we would like to evolve to something else, you don't do that by regulation. You don't do that by building to a higher standard. You actually do that by creating value in a place, and having that value, in a sense, induce the permanence of investment that you want. We just, here in Minnesota, built US Bank Stadium. I don't know if you've had a chance to be in there or not, Daniel.
Only the outside of it. I haven't been in.
Okay, I don't know what you think of it. I think it's one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen. Um,
I oddly kind of like it. I think it was a
Okay.
terrible investment. I'm appalled by the $1 billion for a
uh-huh.
stadium. For don't get me started. But
$1 billion for a football
I have to
stadium.
admit, I kind of like the building. It's,
Okay.
you can see it right down Riverside Avenue from the U of M's Humphrey School where I did my master's program, and people took to calling it the Death Star because it was under construction and it was
Yeah.
like the terminating vista
It's
down the
exactly.
street.
Yeah.
Now that it's done, it doesn't look like the Death Star to me. It looks like a Viking ship, which I think was intentional.
Okay.
But in any case, digression aside, it's $1 billion stadium, big hulking thing.
I haven't had that view. I would like to have that view. I'll try to look at that when I'm at Humphrey next. When I went to graduate school, we of course had the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome, which was built in 83 or 84, somewhere along those lines. And I remember the first time I went to that as a young kid and walked in and was just blown away. Like, this is amazing. It's hard to imagine a structure of greater intensity in terms of resources, the what it took to create and build than the Metrodome. Yet 25 years later, what was its fate? Completely destroyed, right? We imploded it. We got rid of it. It's gone. How long will US Bank Stadium last? 30 years?
That evidence suggests, history suggests.
Right. And so, it's amazing because I think if you wanted US Bank Stadium to last a long time, what you would really need is a really valuable neighborhood that was around and interdependent with that stadium. Like, that's what would make it endure. Not the fact that, like, we've got a good football team, or, oh, Minnesotans really like football. It would be if that was a place that had enduring value because it was interrelated to a network of other things that drew its value in relationship to that. And when you look at the Metrodome, it did none of that. It had parking lots around it and some liquor stores and businesses that, on game day would do okay. But no one identified, like, with that neighborhood and that place as, like, this is central to my life. If you said today, which major public works project from a stadium standpoint has the greatest chance of surviving in Minnesota, I would say it's Target Field. And I would say Target Field because the one thing that has been happening around Target Field is that all that warehouse space has been redeveloped. And a lot of the people who have bought into that are people who, as part of the lifestyle that you get there, are tied into both the games at Target Field and then also kind of the life around Target Field. It's all kind of interconnected. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it ultimately solves the viability problem, but it has a better shot than obviously than the Metrodome or anything else that has really been built.
That notion that the longevity of the building is sort of inextricable from the resilience of the neighborhood is fascinating, and that's something I'm gonna mull over.
Mm-hmm.
I had one more question I wanted to put to you because it's one we get from readers quite a bit, and
Yeah.
it's a bit of a pivot from what we've been talking about. But I think some of these insights that you present a community advocate or a wannabe community advocate kind of coming across this for the first time can get a little overwhelmed and feel like they're kind of drowning in it because of the complexity and because of the interrelationships between all these factors. And then when you simply look at something like a municipal budget or a balance sheet or a CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, these are incredibly convoluted documents, deliberately so, and there's a lot of obfuscation going on, which is something that you have, from time to time, you've done an amazing job in your writing of sort of exposing the magician's sleight of hand going on. Like you wrote a piece about Cobb County, Georgia that did exactly that. Well, here's how this place that is showing all of the warning signs of insolvency gets away with having a AAA perfect bond rating. And here's the trickery going on behind the curtain. Right. And yet, even I, with a planning degree and some background in this stuff, I took a public finance course and I read that and I'm just like, I'm still not sure that I could replicate that analysis for my own community. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering kind of for the Strong Towns advocate who sees all of the red flags, the blinking lights, like, oh, we've got this giant new stadium or convention center or some sort of boondoggle white elephant project, and we've got streets that are falling apart and potholed, and I can tell that things are very wrong here, but I need to sit down for coffee with my city council member and expose them to Strong Towns ideas and actually be able to speak their language, and I don't know how to do that. Mm-hmm. What would you tell that person about kind of where to start? Like, how do you become conversant in the things you would need to be conversant in to make the case that, hey, the way we're doing things is functionally insolvent and we need to correct course?
That's a really good question. And I feel like we struggle with that at times, and I'm the least perfect messenger here. You look at the example you gave of the local government budget and the CAFR and everything else, and them being like opaque documents. And I would even go a step further and say they're documents that are assembled to serve a different master. They don't serve the public. They don't serve the understanding of people who, in a sense, would vote on and make these budgets. They don't even serve the city councils who review them and approve them. They really are in service of this larger kind of growth model that is a top-down, centralized, macroeconomic model. And they signal to ratings agencies and bond holders and others that, this is like, go ahead and continue on with what you're doing. I had a meeting with a bunch of bond rating people, and I walked through why cities were insolvent, and they all were they were like, wow, this is amazing. Like, we didn't know any of this stuff. I went through simple infrastructure projects and showed them, and they were just wide slack-jawed and like, wow, this is amazing. And I said, well, will this change what you do? And they're like, no, cities don't default on their debt. So why would it change what we do? If you're coming into this for the first time and you're like, I'm overwhelmed, there's so much here, what do I do? We kind of wrote the book to help you with that. The book, I hope, simplifies things to the point where it's relatable to people. But if you're having a conversation with someone, you want to meet with someone, I think you have to make it local and talk about like you've got to tell a story about how people really live. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not going to change the direction of cities based on a good intellectual argument from Strong Towns. At the end of the day, the thing that will make our places strong, the thing that will shift the direction is with people talking about their lives and how they live and how we need to be responsive to that. The one that I keep going on and on about here in my hometown is right outside the office here. We just redid this road, millions of dollars, no sidewalks, no place for anyone to walk. It's just a big, nasty strode. Yet it goes from the poor neighborhood in town over there to another poor neighborhood in town. But this one over here has the only grocery store on this side of town. And all day and all evening, what you see is people from that side of town who can't drive, don't have cars for whatever reason, walking this nasty strode over to this side of town where they get to the grocery store. And I mean, it's all day continuously. Why are we not responding to how people live in our community? And you could go through and say, we didn't do it because this road came out of this budget and we got this money from this place and here's their road standard and it didn't include, da, 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 da. And those are all like insider rational reasons for why we don't do logical things. But if you just bring it back to the story, here's people who have an urgent need, who live in our community, who are trying to do a basic thing, get food. And in order to do that, they have to take their life, they have to put their lives at risk just to simply do a very like basic day-to-day thing. Why is this? And how do we address that? And I think when we get people thinking in those ways, a lot of the kind of grand vision for here's how we'll redo everything and all success will just kind of trickle down or filter down to people. When we actually reorient ourselves to look at where people struggle and start to make that the basis of like taking our next step, what we find is that we can make lives better for a lot of people very quickly. And I think we can motivate a lot of people to get on board with that. In a national dialogue, our dialogue tends to, when I hear national politicians talking about caring for the poor or caring for the, what you go through your disadvantaged group. Even though I go to church, this is what we talk about on Sundays. This is what we do. I would like to think that this is the kind of life I live. It's very easy to become disconnected from the rhetoric at the federal level, at the centralized level. And I realize people buy into it in different ways. And some people are very committed to the rhetoric at that level and some people aren't. It is a much easier conversation to have where we can bring in, how do we care for our neighbors? How do we be good citizens? How do we do things that are good and decent and human? How do we make a city that functions, that has an acceptable level of taxation and a good level of service, is fiscally responsible? At the local level, it's really easy to take those conversations, merge them together, and have a real good dialogue about how we do productive things. And when you do that, it tends to be strong. It's strong towns type of work.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Chapter 3 of the book is really that's the rabbit hole. That's the Strong Towns 101. And it really is remarkable how you have connected these insights about finance and about institutions to that much more fundamental question of how do we live and get by in our communities. So
thanks, friend.
Thank you to anyone watching. If you're participating in the Strong Towns Book Club, thanks for your contributions and for the interest you've taken in the book. If you are watching this and you don't have your copy of the book yet, head over to strongtowns.org/book and get your copy of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. And there is an ongoing conversation among all sorts of people who are engaged in this movement, who are excited about these ideas. And you can tap into that at community.strongtowns.org. We've got an ongoing book club. This was our Ask the Author for Chapter 3. We're going to be back next month with Chapter 4 on the infrastructure cult. So a lot of ways to join the conversation, a lot of ways to join the community of people working to think better about these issues in the places they live.
Thanks, man. I'm anxious to talk. I think the next one's 4 and 5 merged together. Okay. And I'm anxious to talk about that one because it's the especially chapter 5 is the one that I would say is where I've been the most like self-taught, let's just say. and I think there's also the most like, crazy ideas. It's the one where it kind of most rubs into, macro public policy, and you've got a real kind of broad cross-section of belief. And I try to cut through that, but I'm anxious to get people's reaction and feedback. I've sent it to people who I know are very left and very right. And I've sent it to people who are economists and non-economists and what have you. And I've gotten all good feedback. And I'm kind of anxious to have someone rip into me and say, here's your blind spot, dude. So
Well,
let's get
you
it
hear
on.
it. We're putting out the call for someone who wants to rip into Chuck.
I would love
I'm
it.
excited for that conversation. So
Yeah.
check back with us next time, everybody. And thanks, Chuck, for your time. This has been a great conversation. And
Thanks, Daniel.
thanks everybody watching for doing what you can to build a strong town. Bye.
Take care.